Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday. Welcome back to yet another episode of Good Grief Life After Loss. This is a super exciting episode for me because this is the first ever guest episode on the podcast. Hopefully, the first of many, many guests in the future. But as I'll say later in this episode, I knew from the second I decided to start this podcast that I wanted my very first guest to be today's guest, and that is Sam Walsh. Sam Walsh and I have known each other for almost 10 years now. She was the intervention counselor at Park City High School at the time that I lost Sam. And she is the creator of Grief Group at the high school. So she is the person that really introduced me to Grief Group, kind of showed me the ropes of that. And I really do feel like she has played such a big part in my grief journey. She is the reason I was able to have such a healthy way to process my grief and to be where I am today. So I'm so grateful that Sam Walsh introduced me to Grief Group almost 10 years ago now. And although I graduated high school many years ago at this point, Sam Walsh and I actually still get to work together pretty frequently because she is an active member on the board of directors of Live Like Sam, my nonprofit in honor of my brother Sam. And she's been incredible to work with. She actually really spearheaded planning our entire Live Like Sam fundraising gala last September. It was a huge, incredible event. We raised so much money, spread so much awareness, and just had a wonderful time. So she's really been impactful, not only in my grief journey, but in the growth and progress of Live Like Sam. So I'm super excited for you guys to hear her story today, get to know her, learn about her experiences with grief and what it was like to start the grief group at Park City High School. So without further ado, thanks for listening, and let's hear from Sam Walsh. First off, thank you for being here. I would attempt to do kind of a background and spiel about you, but I feel like you're probably going to be better at it than me. So I would love if you could just tell my listeners a little bit about you, your background, and what you're doing now.
Yeah, thanks, Skylar, and thanks for having me. My name is Sam Walsh, and I'm a school social worker. I work at Park City High School. I'm here in Utah, and I've been here for 17 years. And I have a myriad of different experiences professionally, doing child protection. I've worked in hospice. I've done private therapy and nonprofits. Um, but my most cherished role has been as a social worker here in the high school, serving teens and families in our community.
That's awesome. Yeah, we first got to know each other through my experience joining Grief Group, but I feel like at the time when we first met each other, it was all such a blur for me. I had like very recently returned from Australia and from Sam's accident. So I don't even know that I necessarily remember how we first got connected. So I'm curious from your perspective if you could share how we first met and kind of your memory of those initial conversations that we had around grief.
Yeah, yeah. And typically, whenever I have a student in our community who suffered a loss, part of my role here in our district and in our community is to reach out to the family initially right after the loss and also, this affected students. And I think it's so perfect that how you're describing not remembering us meeting because that's kind of part of the grieving process, that the things that happen right away after losing a loved one are a blur, or sometimes we have no recollection because of that kind of shock and denial that the body and brain go through. So I'm not offended. It's totally normal and it's a great depiction of the grief process. But I do remember meeting a very young, poised, and lovely Skylar after you returning from Australia and Sam's tragic accident. And I think I kind of knew right away we were going to be BFFs. I saw a very poised, strong, resilient young woman in front of me. Um, and I'm sure that it was a very, troubling and sad and confusing time. But I learned a lot from working with you, Skylar, because your eagerness to learn about grief and like deal with it head on is not usually typical for someone at that young age of, 14, 15, 16, which is, when I first usually come into contact of young people experiencing such a life-changing event of losing a loved one. So you were pretty eager to like dig in, which wasn't always the norm, isn't always the norm. So I love that tenacity about you that even though you were going through such a trying and hard time, you're like, I want to learn about this. I want to know more. How can I help other people? So I felt like you were my co-conspirator in the grief group and, were emerged as an early leader in helping your peers process and move through their grief. But I knew this Skylar, she's going to be a force. So here we are.
You. Yeah, I do definitely remember having a different perspective on grief group than many of my peers, where it was like the last place anyone wanted to be. And I was like, this is great. We're all just sitting here telling our stories. We're eating food and hanging out and skipping class. And like we can all relate. And I loved it. But obviously, for others, it's a very sad and stressful environment. But I'm so grateful for my experience there, which kind of leads me to my initial question of what inspired the creation of grief group at the high school? How did this all come to be?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Well, I guess my passion for grief started, I guess I can trace it back to my time as an undergraduate at Penn State University, studying human development. I studied human development and family studies. So we basically study the human lifespan. And the human lifespan is birth to death and all the different stages in between and different developmental tasks that humans are supposed to be accomplishing during these different phases and ages to successfully navigate life between birth and death. And I took a class, Death and Dying, where we studied the famous work of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her very famous 1969 book on death and dying. And I truly felt inspired by the course and by Kubler-Ross's work. Death is not something, at least in American culture, that we talk about that is viewed in a positive way. And I remember learning that there are other ways of approaching death and dying in different cultures where it's not viewed as such a scary negative experience, that it's viewed as simply part of life. It's one of our developmental challenges and phases facing death and looking back on life. And I just found that to be very hopeful and inspiring. So that's what made me passionate about the work. And I also did in San Diego, I did some work for a hospice organization where I was the death visitor. My job was the death visitor. I would show up after a death occurred of somebody receiving hospice services. And boy, did I learn from my clients and their families and how they usher their loved ones through death and the process. And I realized that what could be more meaningful in helping people at one of the scariest phases of life and helping their family and loved ones with the stress and worry. Um, and I learned a lot of grace from the people I worked with and served, and that's part of my passion. So then coming to the high school as a high school social worker, um, just having a lot of experiences with students returning after the death of a parent. It's usually a parent, a teenager most likely is going to lose a parent, but I have had students lose siblings as well. And I think one of the most important things we can do as humans, supporting other humans, counselor, therapist, or not, is sit with people in their time of need. And I realize that young people that are experiencing grief, they need someone to sit with them in that time of need.
Yeah, wow. Did you experience any pushback initially starting grief group, or was it like everyone was so on board and loved the idea?
No, oh gosh, no. Nobody loves the idea. Whenever I pitch grief group to a teenager, they're like, "What, lady, are you crazy? Do you think I'm going to come in and sit with 10 other kids that I don't know and talk about my scary feelings and cry? That sounds horrible. Like, you've got to be kidding me." So starting it initially was a little bit tricky. I'm sure it involves some bribery of food and fun activities, but it's a hard sell, fun activities and grief groups. So I kind of learned as I went, throughout the years, snacks always helps. Food and grief always go together. I know that kids don't always want to make eye contact or talk about problems in front of people. So, bringing Play-Doh or regularly, adult coloring books, fidget toys, allowing kids to, do an activity while we're talking about hard things, and then always having treats is a help. But mostly all my good stuff that I've learned about running a successful grief group, I've learned from the Skylars of the world, from the students. And something that emerged that I guess really, gelled with my personality is the humor that comes along with loss. And it's a dark humor. And it's a shade of humor that not all people would appreciate or understand, or they might think, gosh, I can't believe they're saying such things about their loss. But humor is a wonderful coping tool of life because isn't life hard? Isn't life dark sometimes? And I really found that that dark humor that we shared in the group together gelled the group together and, formed some really strong bonds. And some of those bonds are for life, like you and me, Skylar. I feel like we're bonded for life because we were sitting with each other in a hard time and finding ways to move forward and cope and laugh. And I think laughter is an important part of grief, laughing at the crazy things people say to you after you lose a loved one. That I know that that was a favorite topic that we like to talk about.
Yeah, I think still people struggle with like the dark humor of grief where it's like you only get it once you get it. And to anyone on the outside, it's like I can't believe someone just made that comment or you're talking about your dead parent or sibling in that way. But it's just like you've got to find a way to find joy in even the worst things. And I do feel like grief group, it would always surprise me as someone's in the middle of telling their story and we're all sobbing and like blowing our noses and it's just like the most upsetting story ever. Someone will say something and all of a sudden we're all just like dying of laughter and it's very grounding and it was so nice to have just a group of people who got that and who you didn't have to explain it to. They understood and I love that.
Yeah. And that really is the core of why we do grief group. And, yes, we talk about grief concepts and we learn, but that community, that coming together and sharing, not the same experience. No two people's grief or losses are the same, but we share a common experience that's especially unique for a kid, for a child or a teen, a unique experience, and we form bonds and we support each other. And that helps with not feeling alone. And I think that's the biggest difficulty with grief. And I hate the stage of grief that they call sadness and depression. I might be sad if I can't find my favorite shoes in the morning. I might feel a little depressed if the weather is not nice out. I like to say despair, that when we're having, that true despair, we feel alone. And that's a terrible feeling to be feeling, such a low despair, and then to feel alone on top of that must be awful for kids. So that is the purpose of grief group, is bringing people together with shared experiences so people don't feel alone. And what's interesting about working with teens in grief is most teenagers think when something bad happens to them, they are the only one that that thing is happening to, whether it's a breakup or parents divorcing or they had to move, cities or towns or schools. Kids always feel alone because they don't have that life perspective yet. So I think that's why grief work with kids and teens is so critical, so that they realize they are not the only one. One of my favorite parts of grief group is the very first day when all of those reluctant teens are like, "What, Miss Walsh, I have to come to this awful grief meeting." And they sit down and I see the expressions on their face like, "Whoa, she's in here. Whoa, that kid, he's in here. Who did they lose?" These are people you're rubbing elbows with at school every day and maybe have classes or you're on a sport team and you don't realize they also lost an immediate family member. And so the bond starts at that first moment when you put eyes on each other because you realize you're not alone, and then you can share your empathy and care with someone else in that same situation.
Yeah, I so vividly remember just being absolutely shocked walking into the room the first time and being like, this person is here. Like there was just there's so much hidden grief and loss that you don't know about, and it was very eye opening for sure. And I'm curious. with the line of work you're in, not even just in grief group, but also just meeting with students on a daily basis who are sometimes at the lowest point in their life and really struggling, how do you feel like you're able to remain positive when often being surrounded by such pain and sadness and grief in your line of work?
Great question, Skylar. Well, I guess I have two answers to that, really. Just first of all, being a social worker in general is hard. Walking people through or sitting with them through their trauma or really low points or losses. I think it's really important for any helper or practitioner with well-being or mental health that you have to be a healthy person. You have to be a happy, healthy, balanced person, not 24/7 because nobody is, but you have to work extra hard at it. Having a happy home life, practicing mindfulness, prayer, or meditation, whatever grounds you or helps you stay in the present moment for joy and peace is super, super important. But then the other thing is and I think I touched on it earlier. I had a wonderful social work colleague that I worked with years ago in San Diego who told me the most important gift you can give to someone is sitting with them in their time of need. And she actually sat with me in a very difficult time of life of grief, not from a death, but grief of a loved one's illness. And she was a great demonstrator of sitting with someone in their time of need. And I thought, I can do this. I can sit with someone in their time of need and not be in it with them, but I can sit and support them and bring hope and support to them. And that brings me joy. It doesn't bring me joy. People have losses or hardships, but it brings me personal, not just professional, but personal joy to be able to be there for someone in their time of need. And I guess, over my 31-year social work career, I've realized how hard it is for humans to sit with someone in their time of need. These are scary topics. People are afraid of death. People that love you and support you sometimes can't show up for you when you're going through grief because they're uncomfortable. They haven't learned about it. They haven't experienced it or talked about it. Maybe their religion or culture, maybe there's some taboos around it. So I think it's a very important skill. And I choose to find peace and joy in supporting and helping others.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And it is very hard to just sit in the uncomfortableness and the awkwardness and the sadness as someone on the other end of supporting someone and just like it's almost harder to be silent and not try and say something because nothing you're going to say is going to make them feel better, but just like the presence of being there. I feel like every time I've had a really strong memorable moment of a friend supporting me, it's like they just came over and we hung out, we didn't talk about it, we went for a drive, we got ice cream, whatever it was, but like they didn't have to like pull all these feelings out of me, we didn't have to have an emotional conversation, they were just there for me and letting me know I wasn't alone. But curious, with your experience, how can like schools and teachers support students coming back to school? Because I feel like I had a myriad of experiences where some teachers felt like it was spot on, they were really there for me, and others was like, all right, you're late on this homework assignment, sorry, but yeah, I'm gonna give you an F on that paper. Like it's so hard. How would you suggest schools and teachers support students coming back after loss?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question. And I think you have to really have a comprehensive plan. And hopefully, I know many schools have mental health or social work resources and many don't. So I think it starts with having the availability of resources. Mental health resources and support in schools is so important. Next, I think communication with teachers, and that's a big part of my role in helping a grieving student, is communicating with teachers about the student loss, giving them options of how they can support them emotionally, academically, in the classroom. And it really is true for, any youth that's been traumatized. I mean, anyone going through grief is traumatized by loss, but certainly there's many other things that kids are traumatized by in life, and helping teachers with strategies on how they can support the student academically. But you have to understand trauma in the brain. If a student is actively going through trauma or a loss, you don't necessarily have their focus, their attention. I always tell kids it's okay not to be on your A game, right? And if you came to school with the flu, would you be at on your A game at 100%? Just like when we're grieving, we can't be on our A game. We can be physically here. I oftentimes use a little metal robot in my office to illustrate for kids. It's okay to be here physically right now and not be here mentally, because there's no way your brain is doing math right now when you're processing the loss of a mom, a dad, a sibling, but helping them return to functioning. So I think a really critical role the school has is, after any trauma or loss, is helping the child return to their normal functioning as soon as possible. But I don't mean being on their A game. I don't mean being mentally there. I mean getting up and taking a shower. Remember to be drinking water and eating food. I call it getting back to the basics. I have to remind my grieving students and even my grieving families and parents, hey, have you drank water? Have you had some water today? Are you eating? Are you sleeping? And, it's amazing that when someone's grieving, they forget about all of those things that they need to do. So, school's job is very critical in helping students return to their normal routine, but understanding that we're not going to have their mind. We need their heart first, like, hey, we've got you. We care about you. We know this is really difficult. We need to be acknowledging that to our students, that we know that what's happening in your life right now is way more important than school. We need to say it.
Yeah.
Teachers need to say it. Admin needs to say it. It's not just the social workers, the counselors. The whole school system needs to address that student in a, discreet and positive way and say, we've got you. We're going to take care of you. We're going to get through this school year. It's not going to be pretty, but we got you. And I always tell my students, I'm like, social workers, counselors, teachers, we're supposed to be professionals and we don't play favorites. I always tell my grief group kids, I play favorites. And if you come in as a grieving student, you're like, Miss Walsh, I need a burrito. I need a power nap. I was up grieving all night. We're going to let you take that power nap, and then we're going to go out and get you a burrito. We're going to do whatever it takes to get you back to your healthy functioning. And it's a process. It's a slow process. But we're gonna be there alongside of you, kind of helping you along with whatever you need. And I think that that's a very important role for schools, because what we know is when a young person has a loss, that puts them at risk for different adverse life events. It could be death by suicide, substance abuse, depression. So I feel that our grieving students are very important kids for me to know and to have my eyes on and to wrap my arms around, to make sure that they are not gonna, be a statistic and have adverse life outcomes. I think that I take that role very seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love all of that. And I do think it's so important to address it correctly. I am a little upset. I didn't know I could get a free burrito if I came to your office, but hopefully,
Stop by next time you're in town. I'll take you out.
yes, if there are any current grief group students listening, now you know. But kind of as you were talking about that, it got me thinking about how important, at least I think it is, to address grief early and kind of head on. I feel like a lot of people leave their childhood and struggle with dealing with childhood trauma that was unaddressed, and it can leak into the later parts of your life. Why do you feel like, and if you feel like it is so
Yeah.
important to address grief appropriately and just in a timely manner and kind of tackle it head on?
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I think it's what's so fascinating about grief and the stages of grief. And, Kubler-Ross, came up with, the original model, and there's been many iterations and new models that are all centered on Kubler-Ross's very important, initial work. But what's so fascinating, no matter what model you're looking at, that these stages are universal. It doesn't matter what country in the world you've grown up in, that we all as humans go through grief. Very not the same process, but very similar stages. So I think it's really important to, acknowledge the sadness and to acknowledge that whole, that person, that loved one, that very special person in your family or your life, that they left. And don't we want to be sad when someone that's cherished leaves our side, leaves our world? Like I want to live in a world where we honor, our loved ones and people that have passed. I think that's a way to honor someone's life is to grieve. And I always say grieving is for the ones that are left behind. People that have passed, hopefully and probably have tremendous peace now. It's the rest of us that are left here, to pick up the pieces.
What do you say to a student who comes to you who's experienced loss and who's grieving, but also dealing with like managing the daily pressures of just being a teenager and homework and friendship and sports? And how do you, what do you tell them? How do you help them get through just like being a teenager in general without all the grief is brutal and stressful and anxiety inducing. When you add grief on top of it, how do you help them get through
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, good question. Well, one other positive, if you will, about grief, it's a tremendous equalizer and helps you get your priorities straight pretty quickly. So I guess, looking back on how do I help teenagers with being a teenager and then also grieving, I think it's just looking at like, man, you've been through this really difficult time. What really matters here? What's truly important? And I think what's interesting, but also difficult to navigate for teens is when they return back to school after going through a devastating loss. Suddenly, the normal teenage stuff is really hard to handle. When kids are in classes, complaining about their stress and their social problems or their oh, my mom wouldn't let me do this. Like just the day-to-day normal teen stressors can really be upsetting to somebody, emerging from their own grief process. So helping them understand that your friend's not being a jerk, your friend's just a teenager, and your friend hasn't been through this really trying trauma in their life and helping create some space and grace for the friends. They're just doing their thing, being a teenager, and helping them find support in knowing that, yeah, it's really normal for you to be annoyed by that. Um, I think is really important. But then really saying, well, gosh, you've had this really tough thing happen in life. What's truly important to you? Let's clear out the garbage. Let's talk about, what really matters in your life. What do you really want to do? You know, how do we navigate this sport or this class? Let's get back to what's truly important for you. And school and sports and friends can be a great escape because doing grief work head on, I'm all for it, but you can't do it 24/7 because that's not healthy either. Sometimes I ask students, hey, how about just for today? Let's try to put our head down and really like pay attention to what the teacher's saying. Maybe you're not getting work done, but let's like really try to focus on what they're saying in class. And that's an escape for you because grief is exhausting. And if we did it 24 hours a day, we'd be sick. Our immune system takes a hit. So giving kids the grace and space to go have fun with their friends, go hang out with your friends and laugh, go for a drive. And then kids will come back and say, Miss Walsh, I did it. I went for a drive or I went and watched a movie with my friend and we laughed and it felt so good and I feel guilty. So helping them normalize, you don't have to feel guilty for laughing and having some joy because your body and brain needs a break from the grief. We can't grieve all the time. So helping them return to being a normal teenager as much as humanly possible, but also having grace for their friends because their friends just haven't had that similar experience yet, which you
Yes.
probably relate to.
Yes, there were so many good nuggets in there. And I think in the moment, it's so hard to have perspective. I remember I feel like we spent like a whole grief group session just complaining about the worst things people say. And someone had brought up, like, they were with a friend just a few weeks after experiencing loss. And the friend was complaining about, like, how they had the worst pimple ever and their life was over and how everything sucks. And it was just like, the perspective is so different. And of course, even after grief and loss, like, yes, it still sucks to have a pimple, but like that perspective of like, this is not the worst thing that has ever happened. You can,
Yeah.
it's just so hard, especially in those initial stages after losing someone to return to life and like the conversations almost feel so surface level once you've experienced something so deep. But I also loved what you were saying about you kind of start to prioritize and realize what's important to you in your life. I had played soccer my entire life, and it was like my absolute favorite thing. And kind of pretty soon after Sam's death, it slowly slipped away. And I realized, like, I don't know, it just, the thing I had loved my whole life, all of a sudden I no longer was interested in and I no longer wanted to do. And it's unfortunate that that happened, but it just like gave me a whole new perspective and outlook. And I started ditching things. Unfortunately, in some cases, I was like, I should ditch history class. I don't need that right now. That's not important. And I do think for young people, you definitely need someone to be steady and stable, whether it's a parent or a counselor who can kind of guide you on the right path of like helping you figure out what's important and how to address those feelings. Because for me, I do feel like I kind of quickly wanted to just withdraw from school and class, and like grief group was my favorite class time, but all the other things, it was like, this no longer feels important anymore. It's hard to care once you've gone through something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Nothing's more important than love and family. Um, and yes, we need to do more to support students um, going through grief.
Yeah. My last question for you is, if I have any listeners right now who are grieving in high school or in college, or they just entered the adult world, what would you say to them? Any advice or words of wisdom?
Well, I think the most important thing is seeking support, whether that's a support group, at school or your university or in your community. I just think a community of support is very critical to navigating grief in a positive way. I also think that, finding the positives, the learning and growing that we do. When we go through something traumatic or experience a very serious loss, it propels you forward in some direction. And each individual that goes through grief, it's very personal. And finding what you're going to do with that. How are you? Because grief is something you really navigate your whole life. And I would love to tell your listeners that when you reach that acceptance, and there are different models that dispute that acceptance stage and say that it's a dynamic process. It's a process you will experience throughout the lifespan. And after learning from wonderful students like you over the years, Skylar, I realize how true that is. Finding how you're going to take that trauma and learn and grow and propel yourself forward. And like sitting here with you right now, I remember telling Grief Group, when you were here at the high school, this is going to shape you in some way. I can't tell each of you in what way it's going to shape you and propel you forward. But here you are, Skylar Jackenthal, doing this very important um, task of talking to your listeners about the grief process and what do people need to be healthy in their grief. This is how you're taking your trauma and healing from it. You're still in that healing by giving back to others, which is a beautiful way to navigate grief in a healthy way. So finding your purpose, and maybe it's just helping other people with their grief and sitting with them in their time of need, finding whatever positive or growth or way to contribute to society, I think is a beautiful way to use your grief in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And that's the goal of this whole podcast, is life after loss. How do we navigate it? How can we make the best of it? So thank you for your insights. That was incredible. That was amazing. I knew the second I decided to start this podcast, I knew without a doubt you were going to be my first guest. And so I'm so grateful that the answer was yes when I asked. I just appreciate everything you do. So thank you. And to
Absolutely.
my listeners tuning in, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review, a comment, or you can message me on Instagram at goodgrief.pod. And again, Sam Walsh, thank you so much for being the first ever guest on the podcast. Thank you for everything you do. And to all of my listeners, we will talk soon.